Yeah, but I think it's not really that great because life doesn't stand still and life is going on, but we seem stuck. And that part
Right.
really, and it worries me more for young people than it worries me for me, because I think of people who are, do want to make decisions about careers, where they want to go, will they ever travel, will they have children? And it's all stuck for them at the moment, I think, at least if they take that attitude that this is blocking us, which is maybe part of Radical Futures, to figure out how it doesn't block us, eh?
So it's a very good segue on what I wanted to discuss with you guys after, let me see, I'm losing stuff here. Where am I? No, there we go. So I was thinking about this, and let me read a couple of things I wanted to do with you guys for today after last week. So for those who weren't there last week, so Iris and Amit, so the prompt was, this is 2025 and we're still in confinement and what's going on. But I was thinking about it the other day, just to pick up on what you were saying, Jill, and I was saying, like, I feel listening to Legault or listening to Trudeau, I feel sometimes that I'm waiting for things to happen to me. And I can't really say that I'm enjoying this. And I feel sort of powerless. And to me, it's exactly where I don't want to be, and exactly what I don't want the future to be. I feel sometimes like I'm like a victim. I'm waiting for other people to tell me, okay, now you can do this and now you can do that. And I was thinking from the very beginning, the idea of this project is we take hold of the future. We make the future our own. We don't wait for the future to happen to us. And I feel right now that the future is happening to us, and we're not really taking hold of that future. So I want to do this a bit differently, take action. Last week, we discussed the narrative, right? We don't really have a meta narrative or narrative for the pandemic. The narrative right now is, you know what it is. It's confine, slow the curve. Nobody wants to talk about the future and the economy, but it's going to be horrible. This is sort of things we're listening to, hearing, and whatever we're listening to is happening to us in different ways. We're waiting for the university to tell us what to do, what type of classes, whether we can open. So I wanted to do a thing a bit differently. So I'm thinking we need to create the narrative, not just discuss it, because others are creating it right now, right? Whether it's the financial system or governments, even though I think governments are doing the right thing, I think they are creating the narrative in different ways. The university is trying to create the narrative, not for negative reasons, but because they have to do this. And I think we need to take the narrative back. So my idea is the following, but of course it could be completely different. My liking of homeworks and assignments. This is sort of my pet thing. So it's like a professor coming back all the time. So I was wondering whether we can, for next week, all of us, do a little letter from the future in any form you want, either podcast, text, PowerPoint, whatever you want. You would take a sector of society that you like, whatever it is. So I was thinking Iris, for example, could be higher education. In 10 years from now, it's 10 years after confinement. Confinement has lasted, let's say, 12 to 18 months, which seems to be, in one way or another, which seems to be where we're going to. And then letters from the future, you're saying, again, we're taking hold of the narrative. This is what happened to my sector in the confinement that was negative, but this is what was positive, and how we were able to take the current pandemic and create something out of it that's positive. So, for example, education, right? Okay, so we're facing online virtual, which is a sort of a half, it's a half solution to a problem. It's not the greatest. However, it's forcing us to think about the quality of the person-to-person contact, the size of our classes, how much more, how much closer we want to be to students in the sense of, not just seeing them as numbers, but seeing them as real persons, how much we can use online and virtual for different things. That was sort of the idea I had. So this is my idea, of course, open to any type of editing, criticism, trashing. It's all part of this. All right, that was my spiel. So the floor is open as usual. Any thoughts, comments?
Yeah, maybe just to open with a prompt. Ahmed, are you still here?
Yeah, sorry, dropped out there for a moment.
Oh yeah, no worries. Okay, so Amit, I don't know if you shared it with everyone, but Amit's been working on a bit of a document that I think conforms at least loosely, not to the format of Letter to the Future, but definitely to the general ambition of what you're getting at there, Olivier. Um, uh, what Amit, and please, explain it yourself in a moment, but the writing that you'd sent me was indicating that basically what you were saying was, following last meeting, what we should be doing is identifying what sort of priorities and narrative we are constructing ourselves. And you had like certain cautions as to how we might do that, writing our own story and so on. Do you want to talk about it briefly?
Sure. So I haven't quite, figured it all out yet. It's just a rough copy that I sent you. Essentially, what I sent to Damien was, so I looked back over the first meeting and the manifesto. I looked at some sort of themes that were emerging about what might be some possible goals that we'd be looking at for this project. I identified like 3 different ones. And then I was saying that all of them have to do with this idea that we're looking at society, we're identifying problems or possible things that we want to improve upon. And we're basically, so the thrust of my little bit there that I sent to Damien was that all of this, it relies on value assumptions that we make. And I was cautioning us about these assumptions and making sure that they're well reflected upon, because small inaccuracies about essentially what we think is the valuable thing is going to distort our cost benefit analysis, and it's going to distort sort of all of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What type of small assumptions, Amit? Can you give us an example?
Sure. So essentially what I was doing in that paper is I went back over the different things that we mentioned and manifesto, and in the first meeting, there were lots of these little terms that jumped out at me, and ones that sort of indicated that we have value assumptions about, let's say, what were some of the ones that I mentioned? There was justice, there was freedom, green spaces, artistic and educational achievement, and intellectual achievement, and economic growth was amongst them. And there were a bunch of other ones as well. And essentially the idea is that a lot of these are very sort of broad and vague concepts. So broad meaning that they refer to lots of different situations, and vague meaning that it's not really clear. So when we say, for example, inequality, it's not always clear what we have in mind. So we have this sort of negative connotations to the word and negative associations with inequality, but it's not always clear exactly what we mean, and if it's inequality per se that we object to, or something about inequality. So if we say, well, it's inequality that we object to, then we just start looking and say, well, there is inequality, therefore we've gone wrong somewhere and we got to get rid of the inequality. So that's missing, they might be missing the point, is what I'm saying. Because if we're identifying inequality itself as the bad thing that has to be gotten rid of, then we're essentially making it sort of a unit within our cost benefit analysis. If there's inequality, it must be gotten rid of. That's sort of the general thrust.
Okay, question, Amit. How do you avoid falling into a rabbit hole with this? And then just thinking about ideas and not actually, being more academic, let's say, than proactive.
Yeah, that was exactly my concern as well. So in the very end of that document, I put a little bit of a how we could actually approach this in the group. And I was thinking, we can't do like an a priori look at all of our values and decide, which ones are the ones that we want to keep, which ones are the ones that we want to examine further. That would take way too much time for this group. It's too far afield. What I was thinking is one of 2 things. One, we could make it a topic that we'd want to discuss on maybe, say, one meeting near the beginning, and sort of devote maybe like half an hour or something to it, just to get it out of the way. The other thing I was thinking about is that we could essentially sort of keep it in mind, and when it comes up, so let's say that we start making some statements and it seems like there's some value judgment at play, people could sort of be aware of that. And then if it seems like it's not really clear, then they can ask for clarification. And if it seems like it's something contentious, then it might be something worth looking into briefly. I had sort of a bit of a procedure for it, just a simplified one. But again, that's all under review at the moment.
Okay, give me I need this to be a bit more concrete personally, and maybe Patrick wants to add something, but I'd love to hear how would you tackle inequality with your process? I mean,
for sure. So let's see. So inequality is one that I actually got into a little bit in that one, and the idea was there that when we say that we have, so let's say I think John brought up inequality on a couple of occasions. And I imagine it is a bad thing that needs to be changed as much as possible. So one thing to mention there is that when we use inequality this way, it's not clear exactly what kind of inequality we're talking about. I actually wrote a paper about inequality a couple of years ago, and there are at least like 3 different types of things that we might be talking about, all of which have overlapping meanings, but not exactly the same thing. Right. Trying to recall them off the top of my head, but essentially the idea would be to look at how we're using the word inequality and say, well, what do you actually have in mind here? What kind of thing are you objecting to? Are you objecting to, let's say, inequality in the amount of goods that people have? Some people are rich and well off, some people are poor and suffering. Or are you objecting to, different, no, let's not go into the other types. Anyways, so the idea would be to say, okay, you brought up this concept of inequality, you've said that this is a bad thing, right? What exactly do you have in mind? And then once you've clarified that, and then the next step would be, after you've clarified exactly what you have in mind, is, okay, so why do you think that's a bad thing? Answering that question forces you to do is it forces you to identify precisely what's bad about it. And if it's just some aspect of the situation, not inequality per se, but something that comes along with inequality, then it would identify that and would say, well, actually, it doesn't seem like you care about inequality. It seems like you care about that thing. That's sort of the general idea.
So it seems to me that this is kind of like an analytical methodology, trying to assess kind of existing pillar values in our society and then reorient our perspective going forward. And then you're proposing that this like new reassessing of existing values is a theme in which we could proceed in Radical Futures. Is that what you're saying?
So I don't know if I'd want to make it, the central theme. It's a project in and of itself, and I wouldn't want to, impose it upon this group. But what I was suggesting in my paper that I sent to Damien, and which I should probably send to you guys now at this point, I was suggesting that little mistakes in this sort of identifying what we find important, little mistakes like that could really like throw us to the winds here. We could start going down complete lines of thought that just otherwise we would not be going down.
Maybe a way to translate that, and this is something that I think we could accomplish in your idea, Olivier, of writing the letter, is just to ask ourselves, what exactly we want to preserve or gain in the future that's different than what we had before this happened, or that's different than what we have now that it has happened. What I'm hearing a lot in your in what you wrote and what you said now, Amit, is just a call for specificity, right? It's okay, when I say this is an opportunity to rethink inequality, it's like, okay, what do I mean? Maybe I mean we should have UBI. Okay, am I following?
So it's definitely a call for specificity, but it's more so a call to identify precisely what it is that you want to change and why you want to change it, and what you want to achieve and why you want to achieve it. The idea there is that if we are too broad on this, then we might be screwing up our cost benefit analysis essentially by saying, well, this is a problem from before, but we haven't specified it properly, and it seems like there was a problem, but actually it wasn't a problem. And in the future, well, we want this goal, but actually we don't want that goal. We want something about that goal. It's kind of a way of, keeping us on track.
For what it's worth, to my ear, this, and this partially to address what Rebecca said, it's not really proposing a central theme of any sort. It's really a basic element of conversation, which is define your terms. That's it. It's just, if we're going to have extended discussions on any given point, inequality, for instance, whether it's inequality or any other major topic that we address, we have to define our terms. We use, not only is the term itself an umbrella term for many different processes in society, but in some cases, given the mix of backgrounds and perspectives we have here, we use words in very different ways on occasion. So this is a call for precision and defining our terms up front so we avoid getting locked down in unnecessary debates.
And that would mean we're talking value assumptions. We've got to also be careful that we don't make factual assumptions when we're making some cases too.
And also admit that we will make value judgments, right? That this is part of the process. Obviously, we are ultimately going to have a set of values that we will be pushing forth, and hopefully in a justified way.
And yet we'll never know until 50, 100 years down the line. But
Did you say 1500?
yes, specifically 1500, 50 to 100, I said, but
That's pretty optimistic.
it's true, maybe 2000.
But to me, really, the idea, and I think I made this right, about being, that's as Patrick was saying, this is sort of the job of the scholar, right? It's to be able to define his or her own terms in a way sort of specifically, or try to do it specifically, while recognizing also up to a point his own value judgment and assumptions, because we'll never be able to be completely, absolutely objective. But beyond this, for me, it's really to take hold of the narrative, which I think we're losing right now, and I think we're really losing that battle. It's being done for us, and it's being decided for us. And I find this troubling because I find myself waiting for other people to tell me what to do, when to do it, what to think, what the costs will be of all this aid that we're giving out left and right, which I'm all for it, but there will be a cost for it. And some of that cost will be supported by young people, which are here, some of whom are here right now, because paying back all of this large investment will take more than two or three years. And the impact will be, unfortunately, might be felt on environmental regulations, maybe on education, on all of these things where, historically we have tended to target when budget cuts were within the government's objective.
So I'd just like to add one small thing here. So defining your terms and being clear is absolutely part of what I'm suggesting. But I'm also suggesting that we need to be more clear and more precise in how we're, how to put this.
To return to how you opened that, I mean, you opened it with this idea that small inaccuracies in our assumptions would distort cost-benefit analysis. So I'd like to just kind of look at all that, because as soon as you get to small inaccuracies in assumptions, I start thinking about chaotic nonlinear mathematics, the sensitivity to initial conditions, the fractalization, the way the butterfly effect, all that stuff, right? The popularized is the butterfly flaps its wings somewhere, starts a revolution somewhere else. And I don't know if we can apply a cost-benefit analysis. Economics is one of these quasi-scientific disciplines that aspires to being predictive, yet rarely is. So I haven't been thinking in terms of this group as being a cost-benefit group. I've thought of this more as a speculative fiction group, a kind of space to extrapolate.
But even your speculative fiction involves cost. As soon as you're saying this might be a better path to well-being than this other one, you have speculative cost-benefit analyses, right? Cost-benefit analysis is just a word, we've an expression we've borrowed to saying, I hope there's going to be more good than bad, or more bad. It's really.
But if we're going to be sensitive to those initial assumptions, what is I'm thinking like at a linguistic level, what is a terminology which might be more amenable or wider than cost-benefit analysis? Like a risk assessment, but even that's kind of like, it's related to the sympathetic, parasympathetic risk fight-flight systems, right?
So here's a good example of defining our terms. So when I use the expression cost-benefit analysis almost daily, I'm not really thinking of economics. I'm just thinking of weighing up advantages and disadvantages over many different domains. So it already is semantically quite a broad expression for me.
Okay, so for you, that term has become neutral.
It's become broad, yeah.
Okay.
But David, that's exactly, remember, one of the things we had discussed at the beginning of this get together after the pandemic is that, and I totally agree with you, we need a new type of vocabulary, a new nomenclature, because using the typical nomenclature like cost benefit, even though I understand what it means, or risk assessment, which is what governments are doing right now, will bring us in a certain direction, because unavoidably these things carry with them assumptions, or not assumptions, but ROEs, to take Damien's term, right? Regime of expectation. When we say cost benefit, we think of in terms of government, and I'm not making judgments here, but we think in terms of government, and bureaucracy, of cost of the society, and triage, and the same with risk assessment. So I would strongly encourage some of you, if you want to do this, and they're not forcing it. If Patrick is comfortable with cost analysis, it's fine. But David, if you want to find a new nomenclature, by all means, go for it. And I think it actually helps us think differently.
I'd rather, perhaps that's my basic tendency, is cost benefit always is more pragmatic. But if we're fully to take like this speculative notion seriously, then I'd like to speak about the larger chance to optimize conditions for hedonic, pleasurable existence for all sentient entities, right? And so to dehumanize it even, and to really expand the vocabulary. So it's no longer saying, we're just going to look at our economy and try to find a way through this. To really think about how can you restructure the universe, which I don't think will ever happen, but it's nice to think about,
Do you already offhand have some expressions that you're more comfortable with? Because I agree perfectly with what you just said, but my version of cost benefit has been semantically broadened to the point that it includes emotion, you see, for instance. Because I couldn't think, it was just easily accessible there. And it's just I've used the expression, well, what's your emotional cost benefit here? It's so yes, when you're including the many different dimensions we need to include in assessing well-being and a path to well-being, we need to include as many things as you've just mentioned. Now, what sort of easy conversational heuristic we attach to that is a collective decision, right? We just, again, we have to define our terms and agree in the way we are using certain expressions. But for me, that expression is easily as broad as that.
Yeah, if I may just jump in on that as well. So the way I was using the term was in absolutely that kind of broad sense. It was actually in a much more philosophical sense, where a cost-benefit analysis would really be a weighing up of the positives and negatives, or the value and disvalue of different options. So this would be an axiology kind of approach, and there's no necessary connection to economics, although it has that connotations in popular and academic speech. It's really more broad than that.
Yeah, but this is where I sort of disagree with you a bit, because even though I understand that I understand for most people, for you, for example, and Patrick, it's beyond, well beyond economics. I think these words carry perception of the world that are economic as a foundation, because it is part of what the words are carrying. If you say cost benefit, you have to see the world in a certain way, even though you say, and I understand, and I'm not criticizing you or Patrick, but I think for most people, it will present a certain structure of the world that is exactly the one we're in right now, even though with small, slight changes. And remember, what we wanted to do originally with this discussion is to go beyond the dichotomy of left and right and capitalism and socialism, which is cost benefit is exactly going back, for me at least, going back in that direction.
To speak also from the same direction as Olivier, I think it's a literary studies perspective to say that we must carefully examine the idiomatic assumptions of the language, the terminology there. And as soon as you have cost and benefit, then you invoke a subjectivity. And the subjectivity's predominance allows you to think in terms of the normative survival processes, which we all do, right? Like we all want to make sure that we have enough to eat and to live and to gratify ourselves in diverse dimensions. And if that subjectivity becomes focalized around that little hyphen, which says we are here and we're on some sort of quantifiable graph structure, which is going to allow us personally. So for me, it can be broadened. And I suspect that the way Patrick is using it is quite broad. And Amit, I think that probably your tendency is to consider it as such. But I think that the term itself is prone to a disintegration, to bring us down to a layer where it's going to be difficult to deflect the innate tendencies of our mind to think in terms of self-benefit. What is the cost to our society? What is the benefit for us? Because it's very rarely spoken of in terms of, I'm willing to take the cost and spend it for the benefit of others. Anyway, that's just my take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so not to disagree too much, but what I would suggest perhaps, if it's a term that might be misleading us here, then perhaps we could use a different term such as, I don't know, a value analysis or a weighing up of values, something like that. Just something to make sure that we understand that what we're really interested in here is the things that we find desirable or not desirable, and to see, to what extent is an option or state of affairs something that we want versus something that we don't want. What aspects of it are desirable, what aspects of it are not desirable. And that's one way to weigh a course of action versus another course of action, or a state of affairs versus another state of affairs, or a goal versus a different goal, something like that. So this is really much broader than subjective values. What values to you? You could talk about social values, you could talk about just objective value. This is a whole field in philosophy.
I would suggest again that all of you feel free to use the term in the nomenclature you're most comfortable with. Now, one of the things that's most important, and one of the mistakes we've done, at least in higher education, is the one-size-fits-all model, right? And I think in academia, we tend to do this, right? We tend to create models, both in science and in philosophy and social sciences. And we tend to pull everything into that model, pour everything into that model. To me, is technology allows us and affords us the ability to think of different models simultaneously. And I would strongly encourage you to use the model you're most comfortable with. So if Amit, this is the model you're comfortable with, go for it. But I wouldn't force David or John or anyone else or myself to use it. And we'll use a different model, and then we'll work with these models together. Even though I agree there has to be some sort, and I think we all agree with you, Amit, like definition of terms and exactly what am I talking about is really important if I say inequality. But if I want to use a different nomenclature, I would strongly encourage you to use the one. and you're comfortable with, and then we'll see, we'll see whether this creates diversity in thought or whether this creates noise in the system.
For sure. And Ari, that the paper that I sent to Damien and that I'm planning to send to all of you guys, I could definitely go back and look for a more neutral or perhaps a more intuitive term to use for that. Maybe just one last point that I was trying to get across before, and I think I didn't quite get across, is that the point of what I was trying to accomplish in that paper was not only to get us to define our terms properly, but also to make sure that when we're doing a cost-benefit analysis or a value analysis, or when we're comparing the pros and cons, we're very clear about what is the pro and why it's a pro, and what is a con and why it's a con. Because if we're not clear about that, then we're just going to be thrown off completely in that kind of analysis.
Is that the uncomfortable Zoom silence?
Well, we have to get on to some things that we might be pro or con about, and then we'll know.
But I would also suggest that, sorry to be such a contrarian to what you're saying, Amit. Sorry about this, really, I apologize. That's not the goal of what I'm trying to do. But I think there's also, in a complex system, and some of you are much more scientific than I am, but I think in some complex systems, things can actually be at the same time pros and cons. And I think I think it's important what you're saying, but it's also important to recognize that some things and a lot of things, I think, are both at the same time. And if you have to choose, we also have to, choose. It's never a clear choice. It's to make it in a popular way. It's the law of unintended consequences. And things are, and sometimes we know, and sometimes we don't, but most of the times we do. And to me, the best example for me is UBI, which we could sit down and say, these are the pros and cons, but the truth is, we don't really know, because if we had really universal income, whether it's $1,000 a month or 12,000, whatever the amount is, there will be unintended consequences that are large that will create positive and negative things at the same time.
Yeah, so Olivier, speaking to that, we don't actually disagree on that, I believe. So that's exactly my point of, clearly specifying what are the things that are positive and negative, rather than pointing at something, well, in this case, it seems positive, or in this sense it's positive, but in this sense it's also negative. If you just call that one big thing positive or negative, or just say that it's always positive or always negative, then you're going to be thrown off completely, because it's not, the thing in itself is not positive or negative. There are positive and negative aspects of it. Now, in terms of, whether we can call something positive or negative in and of itself, I'd say yes, there's at least one thing that I'd be willing to do that for. But I think that for all of these bigger things like UBI or inequality or growth and development and stuff like that, I think we can, if we ask ourselves, well, why do we think this is a good thing? Or why do we think this is a bad thing? Or what's good about it? Or what's bad about it? Then we could sort of hone in on the things that seem to matter more for us, instead of looking at the sort of surface level intuitions that we have about these very broad and vague concepts. And again, I'll try to clarify that a bit more in the document that I'll send out to everybody. Hopefully that'll be an interesting read.
Well, not to put you on the spot, Olivier, but I think you've already somewhat provided your own answer to Amit's question, which is in our first meeting, which is that for you, it's a world with more beauty in it, right? Your nomenclature was, sublime. How can we have a more beautiful economy and so on, right? Like, to me, that's almost an ethical axiom, so to speak, about like what value is. And I think it could lead to an interesting image of what we might want to retain or change given these circumstances.
By the way, I've put in the chat, so part of the document that I did was I pulled out lots of different things that had value assumptions. So within the manifesto and within the first meeting. So I pulled out a bunch of those phrases, and then I've made a list of these seem to be the values and disvalues that we've identified. So I've tried to post that in the chat now. Can people see it? Yeah, I'm getting yes from John. Okay, so that's just some ideas. Well, some things that we brought up, and those could be things that we could potentially address. But again, I feel like I've taken far too much time off this conversation.
Can I quickly say one thing, which is I've been thinking for this. I've been hearing all of you talk, and that just got me back to one discussion that I had with one of my profs at McGill, which was, what are the basic human rights like food, water, shelter? Are these the basic rights? Then why does Canada not have water as the basic right in the Constitution? And then the professor told us that one of the reasons why Canada cannot do that is, even though we want to, because we have so much water, is because US does not recognize water as the basic right to humans. And if Canada does that, the minute US runs out of water or fresh water, they're gonna compel Canada to force and import water from Canada because it's a basic human right in Canada. So they cannot say no to export gallons and millions of gallons of water to US for free.
Yeah, it's also it's also because Canada wants to reserve the right to sell its water. Let's be
Yes, or more precisely, to allow other people to sell it on our behalf. You know, like if you look at the price margins of Neste, you know, am I pronouncing it right? Nestle, that company, the amount of water they're extracting from BC, it's obscene. They pay like a cent for every 1,000 gallons or something. Yeah.
a lot of Canada's water has already been sold. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if I could use this again, and I'm very wary of monopolizing here, but if I could use this as an example, so the example of water as a human right. Well, I'd prefer to speak in terms of values personally, because human rights are, you know, debated within philosophical contexts, and not all philosophers agree that they exist. There's a prominent strain of philosophy called utilitarianism, which really does not agree with it at all. But everybody can sort of agree that there are things that matter to us and things that don't matter to us, and things that have, you know, negative value to us. In terms of, so let's take water, for example. Let's say we talk about water as a human right, or water as something that's valuable. You know, it's not that we're saying that this molecular compound H2O is valuable in and of itself. And it's not that people having H2O is valuable in and of itself. It's that drinking H2O is part of, you know, keeping you alive, and it's integral for your well-being. So what it seems like, it's not water itself that's interesting. It's the fact that it's the fact that it's necessary for well-being, and it's well-being that is important there. So that's one way of specifying exactly what matters. And let me see if I can think up an example here to illustrate my point about why it's important to be clear on this. Well, just like as a toy example, let's say that, you know, if we say that, well, it's water, or people having water, that's the most important thing in the world. Well, you know, if you want to maximize people having water, you could just give each person, well, you could spend all of your resources basically getting water to people, and even beyond the point where it's useful to them, and to the point where you're not spending money on other things that would make their lives better. Whereas if we identify that actually it's making people's lives better that we're interested in, well, we get them enough water so that it matters and so that it makes a difference, and then we stop. We spend our money and effort and time on other things that will make life better for people. So do you see how? Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Aditya.
I mean, I kind of agree with you, but at the same time, what is essential for life? So do you want to provide life to people first, or do you want to care about the betterment of life or the quality of life as a priority? Like, I think surviving in the first place is more valuable. But then again, if you go by utilitarian principle, then that would completely shift the reply. So that's a topic of debate.
Sure. So I'm not actually advocating for utilitarianism here. I don't agree with it. But I don't see those as separate, actually. You know, life is part of well-being. It's a necessary precondition for it. And then once you're alive, there's also a question of how good your life is. So obviously, for your life to be good, it's a precondition that you be alive.
There are a lot of assumptions there, including we can get into very tricky ideas like existence is better than non-existence. And so underlying a lot of people's assumptions about how being alive is the first thing, and then the quality of life is second in some sort of way, kind of implies that sort of thing, which I think is very tricky territory. But just to come back to your point about rights versus values, maybe as a point of linguistic pragmatism, when people say such and such a thing is a right, they are essentially in a more forceful way expressing a value, right? So I don't think we have to trouble ourselves. You bring up a good point. We need to distinguish these things, and rights in the way that some people speak about them almost have to be endowed from the exterior somehow, right? And then you get into even more tricky territory. But in our pragmatic conversation, everyday conversational heuristics, once again, rights are simply a forceful expression of values.
All right, so another uncomfortable Zoom silence. So we haven't heard from Iris and very little from Rebecca and almost nothing from John. Any thoughts on this? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't want us to monopolize the conversation either.
I think we'll have to put someone on the spot.
Actually, if I can jump in for a second. Can you hear me properly? Because I'm not using the same headphones as usual. Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Great, thank you. So I think Amit's point is a very important one, but I wonder whether we can't kind of deal with it as we go, rather than trying to establish a very solid base. Because I feel like having kind of this more engaged discussion on a particular topic, and as you kind of work out this particular, speculative ideal or work out a particular problem, making sure that we touch base on the assumptions that we have and the terms that we're using, and like kind of go back to that. I don't know, I feel like maybe I would find that more fertile territory than kind of, I think what I'm trying to say is I don't see how at this stage of the discussion we're going to be able to identify a set of assumptions and terms that we agree on or agree not to use or something.
All we need to agree to is to be mindful of these little traps and to ask each other for clarification along the way.
Yeah, and I think we've done that very well, and I thank Amit and Damien for bringing that up.
I think it goes back to the methodology, like underlying theme of how we approach this discussion, as we're saying.
I also feel we should talk about the scale of discussion too, because I feel we have been going in and out on a scale of individual versus society versus the world versus the country, like in the past few minutes. So scale might also be important with respect to what we are referring to and what we feel.
So give us a bit more on this, Aditya. What do you mean by scale? Exactly.
Like it got me confused when Amit and I were talking about water as a value, like for basic element for surviving, like a survival of life or like just being existent. And I was talking on a bigger scale as a country, what the country perceives, and then Amit went to an individual perspective of whether having somebody access to water is valuable or not. And then Patrick also commented that on it could be dangerous to not understand the terminologies well. But I think having a scope in our, like a consensual scope in our mind is also important, so that when we are talking about something, we do not change the scale of our understanding while talking to each other. That's all. Because I did get confused for a second. I was like, what? But yeah, I did think about it and then got back on track.
To me, scale is, and maybe that's a bit not exactly the same one that you're thinking, Aditya, but I know because Patrick also mentioned scale last week, essentially the importance of scale and the individual as opposed to the the collective. And if we don't also focus on the individual, we'll just end up with large, I guess, essentially, cliches. To me, scales is also, and thinking back to water, and Damien has heard me say this, and some of you have heard me say this also, is that to me, scale is the gazillion little things all of us do every day. That's what scale is for me. To me, scale is capitalism is not this big thing out there that's mean to us. It's the billion decisions we make, all of us every day, in our world, whether to buy this or to buy that, whether to do this and to do that. And I would say the same thing with water. Yes, there might be outside forces like Neste forcing or having lobbyists in the government doing this and that. But Neste or Nestle is also us buying these products, knowing fair well what they do to us, right? It's me buying almonds, knowing it takes a gazillion tons of water for each almond produced, right? If I'm not mistaken, it's one of the worst user of clean water in the world. But it's good for my health, right? So that's also for me the scale. The scale starts with us. And when did I see this? Was it one of you who told me this? Where I can't remember where I saw this saying, if you think you're too small to make a difference, it's supposed to be an African proverb. If you think you're too small to make a difference, just put yourself in a room full of mosquitoes, and then you'll see that even the small things can have some impact.
But this is also assuming that we are fully aware of the many layers that hide behind our actions. In the case of consumer items, a lot of that is hidden. It's not a transparent system, and it's orchestrated that way so that we, our judgment is clouded, and we are pushed and pulled in different directions. So I think just keeping in mind that that's not a fully transparent situation is important.
Yeah, you can have the equivalent of tobacco warnings and have the pictures of the small children who assembled your trainers when you go to buy them.
Oh God, that would be very effective.
On the label there, so you have Nike and you have a picture of the kids who made your shoes.
Fucking great idea, actually.
Yeah, it actually really is. The factory that burned down so that your shoes could be made.
Or the Ivory Coast slave kids who work on chocolate. That would be a nice one.
Hey, this is actually a really interesting idea to explore. Full transparency of all consumer items and labeling. So
you buy your iPhone in that little well-designed box. There's series of pictures of young Chinese people working in sweatshops to produce your iPhone, right?
Or you get like a social impact tax on each item that you buy, with a full listing of all its socio-ecological impact.
So the advertising would be like our cigarette package advertising now.
That's right. And when you purchase a butterfly, there'll be a little image of like a revolution across the world, like just so you have the exact amount of guilt.
So you caused this war in Micronesia.
Yeah, right.
I think palm oil is doing that with orangutans already, trying to put that image across the world from Indonesia.
Sorry?
The palm oil project from Indonesia, where orangutans have been displaced and a lot of them got killed and went into trade. That's one of the good examples that caught the eye of the global activists. And a lot of people have stopped using palm oil in their products now, including big companies.
So wait, can we go back to that tax thing? Because I think that's really interesting. Because we already have a carbon tax, right?
Yeah.
Now, is that actually helping the environment? Is any of you, because I've looked into paying it whenever I travel before the confinement. I looked into it. I felt good looking into it. I never actually paid it because it's on a voluntary basis.
It's prescriptive, right? It's not an actual.
Okay, but let's say it was a real tax, right? Whenever you took the plane, you would know that you would pay whatever. You go to Paris, you pay $85 per seat for carbon tax, for example. As part of your ticket, you would see it. Would that actually just make us, feel less guilty, or would that actually improve the environment? So a tax on exploitation of other people building our products, would that actually help?
Well,
Sorry, Patrick, go ahead.
After you, please.
Oh, okay. Well, no, I often look at these sort of things as a brilliant way that capitalism has of integrating like its own effects, right? I actually almost kind of admire it, right? So, as a lot of you guys know, like I really like following this one particular philosopher, Zizek. And he has this great example of like a Starbucks coffee mug, right? So like you go into Starbucks, and you buy a coffee, and there's like this big poster, and it says like, okay, 10% of our proceedings go to like some Guatemala solar powered farm project, whatever. And his analysis, I think, is very lucid, right? It's like, it's not then that the company is, you could say, actually trying to compensate for its effects. What it's realizing is that sorry, John, that's Slavoj Zizek. That's Zizek. And then it's got the funny little upside down hats on the top. I forget, I don't know what they're called. But yeah, in any case, so the idea then is that what you're doing is you're purchasing rather the virtue of doing your part within the economy, right? Okay, so it's like the economy generates products that have negative effects. It realizes that people don't like participating in those negative effects, so then it sells the moral way out of the effects too, right? Okay, and that's sort of always been my hang up with these sort of tax things, right? Because on the one hand, it's like, okay, you're disincentivizing something, so there is a good effect, but on another hand, what you're doing is you're commodifying a guilt-free attitude, right?
Not only that,
so
but
yeah.
Sorry.
There's,
No, please.
I'll also add on to that it also fascinates me how all these big corporations, when they try to do something, try to do it in an underdeveloped or developing country, whereas Canada itself could use some help in terms of First Nations, for example. But nobody like plans to give anything to them, or no corporation plans to highlight that because it brings bad image to Canada or bad image to the corporations. Like it's such a weird understanding of like only those countries or those people need help with these projects and not us or not the developed nations.
And the thing about taxation also is that generally speaking, it works. So it has its effect on behavior, but it also has a very predictable effect that stratifies a code according to socioeconomic status. So to come back to your question, Olivier, which is that if you can afford it, especially if you can afford it easily, then it becomes guilt alleviation. And for those people who can't afford it, it becomes behavior modification. So you diminish the behavior in the people who can't stand the tax. And for those who can, you make them feel a bit better. And of course, the bigger question, so it stratifies society and amplifies those differences that are already there, because for those people who can afford it, they don't have to change their behavior and they will still have access to what they want. But also the more general question about, for instance, carbon taxes is that we're talking about very different things from a sort of, how should I say, a transparent, well-governed national level carbon tax of some sort versus whatever private little company saying it's going to charge you a carbon tax, and we don't actually even know where the money goes in many cases. Is any of that money reinvested into anything meaningful to carbon? We don't know that in most cases.
So if I could jump in here. Sorry, go ahead, Rebecca.
No, I mean, I just think then it might be worth exploring this idea not as a tax, but as some other disincentive. And I'm trying to think of what that could be.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is that this is actually a perfect opportunity to sort of exhibit what I was going to suggest. So look, we have a perfect example here. We have this idea of, well, we want a carbon tax. Why do we want a carbon tax? Well, we want to protect the environment. Okay. We can go deeper and ask, why do we want to protect the environment? But let's say that, environmental protection is just something that's interesting to us. And then we're asking here, well, will carbon tax actually do that, or is it just making people feel better, or what's the point here? And the idea here is that, well, if we examine this a little bit more closely and we examine the assumption, well, carbon tax is a good thing, we want a carbon tax, we would say, well, actually what we want is environmental protection, right? Not people to feel better about it. So is carbon tax the most effective way to get environmental protection? That's sort of a way of shifting away from, well, this is a good thing, so we want to go about how to implement this, versus, well, this is actually the goal that we're interested in, and let's look at different ways to get to that goal. This is kind of the thing that I was going to go into. And this is, again, like Ira said, something that we can just do as we go along. It's not something that we have to do at the beginning and identify all of our values from A to Z.
An impossible task.
Thank you, Amit. That was really helpful. It's actually an excellent point you're making about carbon tax, and I think we're shifting. Sometimes we're shifting from as you said, what's the goal, to the actual, just to become the object becomes the end, becomes the means becomes the end, instead of the other way around. By the way, I'm sorry to say, just an aside, and I'll stop from there, but to me, I see carbon taxes, I think they're the same as indulgences from the Renaissance, right? I mean, you buy your way out of hell by paying a tax to the church, right? It's been a great system for the Catholic Church, by the way. And this is, I was reading that this is part of the way they actually finance the building of Notre Dame.
Never mind the Middle Ages. Pope Benedict was offering a sort of indulgence for subscribing to his Twitter feed.
I think religious systems are a really good way for us to understand these value judgments at a kind of more concentrated level. And then we can kind of extrapolate that, because we're people, and people follow very similar thought patterns, whether or not they're religious. And often I think we take the patterns that we recognize from religious upbringing and then reincorporate them into society without really understanding where those thought patterns come from.
Well, in fact, what I would suggest there, that's often explicitly true, that we're getting some ideas from some domains and making them secular in some ways. But one of the clues there, I think, is we're not, in many cases, getting certain ideas directly from religion. It's just that our minds have certain tendencies. Absolutely. And they will express themselves in religious and other domains.
I just think they're very obvious in a religious.
We're very disposed to religious thinking,
Absolutely.
whether it's applied to religion or not. There's something I often refer to as religious thinking, which we express in many domains of life that separate from religion.
By the way, I just wanted to say this last week, and I forgot, but it reminded me after it came back to me after we had the discussion about narrative, and now that you guys are talking about religion and the importance of narrative. So I had this experience, I guess, that's how I would put it. When I was in my old position, of course, we had the MasterCard Scholars, as you all know, which are some of the greatest young scholars from Africa coming to different universities across the world, funded by MasterCard. And I can't remember, it was early December, I think. One of our scholars, a young woman, got hit by a car. She just slipped on a typical ice patch, got hit by the rétroviseur, the rearview mirror of the car. She fell into a coma, and she stayed in a coma for about, I don't know, almost 12 months, if I'm not mistaken. And there was no way to revive her. So she was a young woman, 22, 23, great future in front of her. So we brought her mother from I can't remember which country she was from, but we brought her mother home. We brought her mother to Canada, and we also brought her sister, and it was an excruciating experience for both of them. And Miguel was helpful, and MasterCard also. But all this to say that I couldn't imagine what the woman was, the mother was going through. And she also had all sorts of different hopes. I saw her move, I saw her this, I saw her do that. And I remember I even called the doctor at one point. I said, "Is that possible?" The doctor said, no, it's not possible. There's no way she would come back. And in a way, we were lucky because the doctors say it can go on for 2 or 3 years. So after 11 months, almost from one day to another, she passed away, which was a relief for everyone. But all this to say is that that woman was able to sustain this because of her faith. And I sort of envied her because, not her situation, of course, but because I don't really have faith. And I was wondering how would I have reacted to something like this without faith? So that to me is also the narrative in a way, right? So the religious, Patrick, you're talking about our mind has, sort of geared towards the religious. I think we're sort of geared towards finding reasons for this and finding in these reasons some clarity. And I think that without narrative in our world right now, we're losing sometimes the ability, sometimes this is a good thing also, because it also allows us to see more clearly and not being taken by ignorance and superstition. But sometimes we also lose the ability to face difficult moment because we have very little narrative to hang on to. And I think, as we said, Damien and I wanted to pull away from the narrative of the 20th century, but communism was a strong narrative. A lot of people to be able to go through all sorts of difficult experiences. Fascism was one too, unfortunately. So I just wanted to bring this up because in a world where we float without narratives, where we only have meta-narratives, maybe one of the reasons we're seeing so many mental health problems right now is, and I have no proof for what I'm saying, is also because we are sort of floating without any type of meta-narrative.
Well, to combine a few things that have been said so far with what you just said, Olivier, is in part of what we're seeing a displacement across scales. So we're moving from grand narratives, be they religious or political, to much more emphasis on individual narratives. And that's feeding several of the things that have animated a few of our discussions so far, right? Which is atomization and problems with collectivity in mission and objective, etc. So you're right, narrative always has to be there in one form or another. But maybe one of the main things so for instance, to take a local example, which I think also happened in Spain and a few other places, we know, if you know the history of Quebec, you know the extent to which Catholicism permeated the society, and to the point also where, if you look at structures of power, the church had more power than the government in so many ways. And this, very famously, during the Quiet Revolution, was dispensed with in an unusually quick way that sidestepped the social and philosophical reconstruction you need to go through to fill in the vacuum left by everything you've just ripped out very quickly. And in some ways that you can speculate on what that vacuum was filled with. I think here and in Spain and a few other places, I think it was filled with, among other things, consumerism and nationalism and a few other grand narratives in some cases, right? Narrative always has to be there. And if you pull it out in some way without reconstructing, you get weird side effects. But yes, maybe to tie a few things that we've mentioned even today, maybe part of the problem you're describing is moving from a grand narrative to an individual narrative, which is in some ways lacking collective meaning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But of course, the sort of negative aspect of grand narratives is they tend to eliminate differences, right? So the difference between, as you said, Patrick, atomization, which is the focus on narratives at the individual level, and the grand narratives, for example, the 50s, right? So the American politics is based on that dream of the 50s. the right and the left has that dream of the 50s, right? So for the left, it's it's the factory worker who earns enough, and it's the golden age of the union, and who earns enough to, support all of his, of course, family. And for the right, it's a time where Americans were strong and didn't depend on small fractured narratives. But of course, this was done on the back of women, minorities, and and everyone that didn't fit the typical heterosexual male model. So that's to me is interesting. The interesting dilemma we're facing between the grand narrative, which is needed for us to sustain different things, and the fact that often this grand narrative can only exist because it is a grand, clear narrative, which by definition doesn't allow too much differences or different points of view to move in.
I think there's several potential traps there that we keep falling into over and over again in history, which is we're appealing a bit too much outside of ourselves for meaning and direction. Yeah. And you either appeal all the way to a god or to your government or to your grand political reform, if you insist on placing that pursuit of meaning on a single dimension, where you can only move the scale from the individual to the grand thing that eliminates individual differences. If you insist on that single dimension, you will always be faced with that problem. The thing is to realize that the construction of an internal model of meaning is multidimensional, and you don't have to fall into that trap.
That's kind of interesting because I think that can also be maybe one of our thematic ways of understanding what we're trying to get at through this exercise. This Radical Creatures exercise kind of goes back to this cost analysis pro-con dichotomy. And if we're trying to look at even just personal kind of personal growth or collective narrative versus individual narrative, we can't look at it as one or the other.
Look at what's happening now during the pandemic. So go to pretty much any major news outlet, and even more so the ones that have a relatively narrow, well-off demographic. And 90+% of the content about how to take care of your health is really superficial level indulgences for the individual. It's how to, pamper yourself. And we have enough information, we have an increasing amount of scientific information showing what happens to you when you spend so much time navel gazing, There's even some tentative ties to something called the default mode network in the brain. And how I'll just seed this idea because it's connected to a million other things that I think are very pertinent to our conversations, but it would take a lot of time. But very interestingly, there's sort of a balance point between how much time we spend inside our heads, ruminating and projecting into the future and thinking about the past, versus being immediately engaged by the world, by another person in conversation, by something very immediate and instantaneous. And it seems that if you go towards the inside part of your head, in that balance, the more time you spend there, the less well off you're going to be. I'm not going to sort of spend time describing right now the metrics that go into measuring your well-being in those cases, but basically just let's go with that very vague term right now. And what's very interesting is that you would imagine, well, is this because the less time we spend engaged with the world in a very immediate way, and the more time we spend inside our heads, we tend to think a bit neurotically and think about difficult things in our lives. But if you analyze these data and co-vary out the valence of the emotion, in other words, you statistically control for the valence of the emotion so that you take care of this idea that it's because you spend time thinking about difficult things, you're still left with this effect. And I've always had this idea about the fact that, there are more than just physical signs about the fact that we are not the end product of evolution. It's not just our wonky spines and all sorts of things that don't work well. We are not at the end point of evolution in terms of this little voice we have inside our heads and how to deal with our own consciousness as well. And there's a reason that solitary confinement is one of the ultimate punishments that you can impose even on people who are, spending their lives in jail. So all of this is related to, as well, this sort of balance point that we try to find in how to take care of ourselves, but understanding also that taking care of ourselves relies very heavily on taking care of other people, and again, expanding this narrative. And all of this pandemic advice about how to take care of yourself while you're self-isolating is really, really missing that point for the most part. But yeah, there are several issues to get into here about, again, not placing all of these considerations on a single dimension where you're in a necessary trade-off between yourself and other people. It is more of a multidimensional problem, and it has to be addressed in that way.
Patrick, I've actually studied well-being quite a bit, philosophical and psychological side. Could you actually send some of those articles if you know what they are? I'd be really interested to read those.
Sure, I can look into a couple of them. I can tell you it's a young literature, and it's very messy, and some of the ties to neuroscience are, in some cases, tentative, in other cases, downright fluffy. But there's something there. There's something there that's going to take a while to figure out, but if you take psychology and philosophy and a bit of neuroscience all together, there's a compelling case there that I think is worth paying attention to. The jury is still out and will be out for a while, but there's something going on there. Yeah.
I would really love it. Oh, sorry, Olivier. I would really love a chance to read those as well, because it's very different from what I've seen on the Default Mode Network. Other than, I guess, there's lots of interesting work in psychedelics. I don't know if that's the body of literature you're referring to.
It's related to that. There's some people who are approaching it from that direction. From there, you get into the dissolution of self. Mm-hmm. And again, the illusion of self is at the center of this idea that we're sort of sitting on a throne somewhere behind our eyes, observing this bit of theater that is happening to us, right? Mm-hmm. And the link to psychedelics is that you have a very small class of compounds, actually not a single class biologically speaking, but in terms of their effects, they're sort of a class of compounds that have this ability to some degree to reduce this illusion, to make you simply much more connected with the moment to moment experience and sensation of being in relation to the world. And this is what psychedelics in some cases are getting at, especially a guided session of psilocybin in some way, or it's also supposed to be what certain forms of meditation are trying to get you towards. It's again this very powerful illusion that we are slavishly bound to in so many ways, that we are not bodies, we are a mind with a body, a self with a body, that we're driving around this world in some way. And the relationship to the Default Mode Network is not super clear. By the way, because not everyone will have been exposed to this idea, I can take maybe 2 minutes to just explain what it is, if that's all right. When you do brain imaging studies, one of the most simple experimental paradigms is to have you perform some sort of task. Let's say it's an auditory memory task, just to cite something I've dealt with, right? So you have a pattern of tones that you hear, boop, 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 boop. You have a delay of some sort, and then you have a second sequence that you hear, and you have to tell me if it was the same or different, right? So it's just tapping into your auditory working memory. So you have an infinitude of tasks that you're asked to perform, and then you also typically have either a control task, so another active task, but that is getting you to perform a different cognitive operation, or you have a resting task where you're asked not to do anything. And depending on your design, you will either take your task of interest and compare it to a control task, another active task, or compare it to silence or rest of some sort. And what happened is that you had 20 years worth of data accumulated this way, and as the analysis methods got more sophisticated and more sensitive, people started to look at the resting task. In other words, the thing that was meant to be nothing, that was meant to be your contrast point. People started to analyze this, and for a bunch of technical reasons, it's extraordinarily tricky and dangerous to analyze those data. But something started to emerge from it, and this is what we refer to as the default mode network. It's a series of regions in your brain, quite reliably the same regions, that are activated when you're quote unquote doing nothing. Now, none of us is ever doing nothing. And that's the point, is that in some way, it seems to be capturing wandering. And there seems to be some interesting information in there. It's also interesting for a bunch of other reasons. The areas in the default mode are quite reliably some of the ones that are affected by Alzheimer's disproportionately, for instance. There's lots of interesting information that's coming out of this. But the tie, because the concepts philosophically of self and many other related ideas are slippery and difficult to deal with, the ties to the neuroscience are equally tentative, right? But again, there's something going on there. I'm still exploring it myself. And it's relevant to a number of the topics that we're trying to deal with here, because once again, and this I think was my point at the end of, unfortunately last week I was only able to come in at the end of the conversation because every 2 weeks I have a lab meeting at the same time. But a lot of the ideas we're discussing at a social scale are necessarily related to the individual scale and what we invest ourselves in and the elements we use to define the contours of our identity. And that, to me, is a crucial element that I keep coming back to. I can never quite escape. And I'm trying to figure out if I can't escape it because I'm creating an obsession for myself, or because it's truly fundamental. And the reason I keep coming back there is because it really does underpin many, many things, what we invest ourselves in. And to give you a preview of this, if we'll finally do what Olivier asked me to do, which is to prepare a little blurb about this, the fact that we are largely societally and individually invested in accidents of birth, in things that were determined by a grand cosmic lottery in which we played no role. And that is poisoning our minds, and it's poisoning our social level discourse, I think. But anyway, there's my speech of the day. I'll stop there.
Okay, that's a perfect ending to this thing. So next week you're at your lab, I think?
So every 2 weeks I typically have a lab meeting at exactly the same time, 10:30. So it's not perfectly reliable, and I can.
So can we have your blurb in 2 weeks then? Not next week, but the week after?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Because I really want us to explore this further. So how do you guys want to do this sort of little exercise of, because I really want to, we had a great discussion today. It was really, really interesting on the narrative, but I really, to me, I really want us to build something, not just discuss it, even though the discussion is fascinating. I just really want us to build something. So how do we want to do with that? And to me, the narrative or the ROE, or depending on how you want to define it, is fundamental. So we have a different discussion, but I really want us to sort of take hold of the narrative. So how do you want to do this? I was thinking of a different little thing. It's going to sound really corny, and probably most of you will dislike it, but it could be an exercise where we reinvent our national anthem. That could be kind of interesting to do. For Canada, our home on native land, as one Canadian stand-up said.
Nationalism.
Spain has no lyrics in its national anthem, and it's such a comforting thing.
But you know, Damien knows about it because I discussed this with him many times. But if you look at the francophone version and anglophone version, it's really interesting because in French it says "protégera nos foyers et nos droits," so government will protect our rights and freedom. And in English is "we stand for thee," so we will protect Canada. It's a completely different perception on, you know, our relationship to government. It's really in the same national anthem, but. So how do you want to do this beginning of narrative from your own point of view and with your own nomenclature? It doesn't have to be, you know, you use whatever nomenclature in whatever sector you want to discuss, but to start taking hold of your narrative. How do you want to do this?
Right, so I'm seeing Iris's comment in the chat there. Rebecca had sent, I think just to you and I, Olivier, an email with a Google Drive that we might be able to all share. So if you guys are comfortable, whatever it is that we write, it might be a good idea to write them in Google Docs that we can access if we're comfortable seeing each other's, you know, half-formed drafts. I realize that's pretty intimate, but
yeah, we can share a folder, or I mean, Olivier, if you're comfortable, we can share the Google Drive with the team and then proceed. Just create a dedicated folder for maybe exercises. I do like this national anthem idea, but then it also has these like political nationalism components, like at its core, that maybe aren't the only focus that we want to.
So let's keep it open. Fine, you know, do a narrative from 2025 after a, you know, confinement of 12 to 18 months, more or less, right? Which it seems to be what we're going through. It's, you know, and a partially open society, but all sorts of different things, and probably at least one full semester online, would probably less travel on all these things. So 5 years later, you know, take hold of the narrative. And the idea is not only to look objectively at society, but to actually push the world in the direction you want the world to be pushed in. I think it's really important, depending on whatever sector you want to do. So it could be a national anthem, could be music, however you want this to be. I think that's actually going to be even more interesting if we have different forms to do this. And just, and Rebecca and Damien, if we can just send a link to the Google Drive to everyone. Will they have access to it, even though they're, you know?
Well, yeah, can we do a test? Damien, can you just, without logging in, can you just try to access the folder that I had, or the link that I had sent?
Yeah, so I was able to open it yesterday, so if it doesn't work now, I'll be surprised, but I'll give it another shot.
Do we have to invite the other people like Jill and Patrick to have access to that folder?
Yes, and I mean that I can easily do, and we can test editing settings. Damien, if you could just test to see if you can create a new document. That's more my concern, not just opening.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, I'm just pulling it up. My internet's a little bit slow today. I'm sorry. It's loading.
When is your internet fast, Damien? Between 2 and 3 in the morning?
Yeah, it has brief moments of inspiration, you know.
Okay.
But you know, it's literary. They're unpredictable. They come at their own volition.
Sounds like me.
That's right. That's right. Well, there's an author in there somewhere, Rebecca.
I have a question. Is all the references that are flipping up and down in the chat, are they going into a bibliography folder somewhere so we can start?
They can.
So I've sent you the text from the chat from last week, but now I've started to upload the whole folder in the Google Drive for Radical Future. So you'll have the whole folder with the complete Zoom, recording, plus the chat. Everything will be in the folder with the date on it, and also upload the video, shorter version of the video on YouTube. But I'll put that into the the Radical Future Drive. So you'll have everything. But I'll send you a copy by email also, Joe.
You said that the you weren't able to create a separate YouTube channel and upload videos of the length of these meetings?
It's because when you want to upload for a certain amount of time, you have to verify a certain thing. So I can do it on my account, but if I create another account, it seems to be a bit tricky. I'll try to do this and create a different, or you can do it, Rebecca, just a Building 21.
I think it might
video
actually
channel.
be useful to have a Building 21 private channel.
Yeah, I think so too. So if you want to maybe create it, I can try I can try, you can try. It doesn't really matter as long as we give each other the ability to upload stuff there.
Okay.
All right, this was a lot of fun, actually. Honestly, it's good. Mind. It's the food for the brain. My default mode is actually enjoying this, I think. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. This was amazing. So I'll post everything and stuff, and we'll drive, and let's have for next week some sort of narrative. No matter how you want to do this, you're free to do it any which way you want. Last two small things. Aditya, why is there two Aditya every time you log in?
Because I'm using my phone for the video, because the desktop doesn't have a webcam. But all the documents and chatting and everything I use desktop, because I can't type while I'm talking to you guys at the same time using my phone. So that's why two Adityas.
Okay, but you only get one vote.
Yes.
Okay. And one last thing, how are you guys able to follow conversation and chat at the speed you're chatting? I just don't get it. To me, it has to be one or the other. I can't do both.
It's because they're very young.
Okay.
We're conditioned to texting in class. Yeah, so.
Speaking of which, Rebecca, let's call quickly about the Google Drive thing right after, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
All right, thanks.
Women should be able to do it better because we're supposed to be multitaskers and men aren't. We've evolved that way. They did a study of Russian cosmonauts, right, Patrick? The women were better up there than the men.
Yeah. We can talk about sex differences another day if you like. I can barely do either one alone, so.
I do too.
You mean being a cosmonaut and texting?
No, I mean chat or speaking.
Stop.
All right, everyone. This one's fun. Thank you so much. Take care. See you next week.
Bye.
Thank you.